Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to the Galactic Archives. I'm Meshla. Tonight, we're returning to Steps into the Past with Chapter 21, Shifting the Lines. This chapter carries a particular kind of tension, the kind that moves slowly. Lines begin shifting, pieces are being set in motion, and people are beginning to understand that what looked contained may not be contained at all, and that some truths arrive in silence before they're ever spoken aloud. So whether you're here for the story, the lore surrounding it, or simply for a quiet place to spend part of your evening, you are welcome here. Also, before I get into the story itself, you might notice that I have some new stream art. Ta-da! So, yes, I am actually pretty pleased with it. I am testing it out to see how it works. All right. There we go. Steps into the Past, Chapter 21, Shifting the Lines. Calculations in the quiet. Catane Fleet Yard's Admiral Connor's office. The lights of the Catane Fleet Yards glittered through the office viewport, the slow-moving silhouettes of ships drifting in the black like watchful sentinels. Admiral Connors leaned back in his chair, the warmth of his evening tea seeping into his fingers as he reviewed the last of the day's briefings. Outside, the steady hum of the yard's defense grid was almost soothing, predictable, methodical, the sound of mid-evening without alarm. Traffic moved in measured lanes. Repair tugs crossed between hulls and under floodlights. Dock indicators glowed and dimmed in sequence, a choreography of order that had long since taught him how to hear trouble by its absence. That rhythm broke with a muted chime from the comm unit on his desk. It was not the public channel. It was the secure one. Connor set the datapad aside without haste, though his attention sharpened immediately. Patch it through. The transmission resolved into Ethan Bevan's image, flanked by two figures in Jedi robes. Connors took them in at a glance, posture, bearing, and spacing. One held herself with the stillness of long discipline. Her presence drawn so tightly it read as silence rather than absence. The other stood slightly forward, his weight balanced on the balls of his feet, coiled and contained as if ready to move even while standing still. The attire of both was distinctly Katane. Students of Card, Connors noted. That alone carried weight. More than that, though, this was not a casual formation. Ethan was centered, but he was not shielding either of them. They were flanking him by choice, not deferring to him and not tucked behind him for cover. That meant that they had already crossed the threshold from witness to participant. Connors had spent too long in command rooms and briefing halls not to recognize the shape of aligned intent when it stood in front of him. Ethan didn't waste any time. Admiral. Connors inclined his head. His fingers rested briefly against the desk before moving. His index and middle fingers touching once at his collarbone and then sliding down toward his sternum in one smooth motion. Veil check. Ethan's left arm shifted as if adjusting his vambrace. The motion concealed the brief curl of his fist to his chest. Two light taps folded into the setting of his posture before his hand dropped. Clearance confirm. A haptic pulse followed through Connor's glove channel. Veil layer Sigma 7 active. One long pulse, one short, another long, and one final short pulse. Only then did Connors lean forward. Speak. Ethan didn't begin with the problem. That, Connors realized quickly, was deliberate. We're requesting your attention under seal. Ethan said evenly. Not because of what has already occurred, but because of what may follow if we misread the situation. Connor's eyes flicked once, briefly, to the Jedi. She had closed her eyes, not in meditation, but as if she were listening to something that required quiet rather than focus. When she opened them again, her gaze met Ethan's for half a heartbeat. There was a silent exchange that passed between them, too subtle for an untrained observer to name, but Connors had spent his career reading command rooms and briefing areas. Alignment confirmed, he thought. We have cause for concern regarding our missing operative, Ethan continued. Connors did not repeat the name that went unsaid. His gaze returned fully to Ethan, though his peripheral vision checked the Jedi pair. A small movement of his hand, 2 fingers brushing once at his temple and then settling at his jawline before dropping. Identity shift. The younger Jedi answered without hesitation, returning the same contained motion with practiced certainty. The woman beside him mirrored it a beat later, slower and more deliberate, but it was no less certain. Connors nodded once. Cure is inbound. Medical and debrief are staged. Respectfully, Ethan said, and the word mattered. That may not be sufficient. That caught Connor's full attention. They've changed focus, Ethan went on. This was no longer merely about containment or leverage. The objective has escalated. Connors folded his hands and leaned forward slightly. Define escalated. The younger Jedi stepped forward. It was not abrupt and not in challenge, but because the moment required it. The movement was small enough to respect the gravity of the call, but deliberate enough to signal that what followed was his to say. What we have reason to believe, he said, choosing each word with care, is that the original objective failed. The follow-up action was designed not to extract value, but to ensure silence. Connors watched him closely. The young Jedi was not being dramatic, and he was not simply speculating. He was reporting a conclusion reached at a cost to himself. That kind of action, Jared continued, doesn't end in the field. The woman beside him shifted almost imperceptibly. Her attention sharpened, not outwardly, but inward, as if testing the shape of the words against something she felt rather than heard. When she spoke, it was not to explain, only to confirm. There was intent focused beyond the initial sight, she said quietly. Connor's jaw tightened. Whatever was used, Jared added, was designed to persist, to move, to survive the initial recovery and to reach places it never should have. Connors didn't need force metaphors for that. Catane, he said quietly. And Catan, Jared replied, possibly beyond. Silence settled over the connection. Connors leaned back, his eyes drifting briefly to the viewport in his office. The fleet yards continued their measured ballet, launch windows, slow-moving repair tugs, and patrol rotations. Order, systems, and predictability. He thought of Druckenwell's reports, of Greer's phrasing, and of the way certain incidents never quite fit cleanly into after-action summaries. It was not a strike meant to win, but a probe meant to test. You're telling me, Connor said at last, that this was not an isolated field action. No, sir, Ethan replied. We believe it was a test and a message. Connor's hands lowered to waist level just within the frame of the holofeed. Both curled into fists, and his first knuckles tapped together once. Grounded, controlled, and without flourish. Double anchor. Ethan matched the gesture without pausing, returning the same command-level confirmation with equal economy of motion. Connors nodded slowly. He trusted patterns, he trusted people who brought him bad news without embellishment, and he trusted Master Card's judgment enough to know that his students would not make this call lightly. I don't pretend to understand how you came by this assessment, he said evenly, his gaze returning to the Jedi. But I trust the people who taught you, and I trust the cost you're carrying for making it. The younger Jedi inclined his head, just slightly. You'll have clearance to dock under veil, Connors continued. No public manifest, no standard logs. He paused and then added more quietly. And I'll see you on Catane. In person. The hollow feed cut. Connors remained where he was for a moment longer, his tea cooling in his hands and his eyes on the slow drift of ships beyond the transparisteel. The fleet yards continued their watch, unaware, as always, of how close the veil had come to fraying. Please feel free to yell at me if you see me slouching. That's what the commands are for. Wait 1 second. Sorry about that. That's why I muted up. Tanagas 5, Durza Estate. The hollow feed died with a soft final click, the projector dimming to a dull red standby that lingered a second too long before fading completely. For a moment, the room felt larger without Connor's image anchoring it. The quiet stretched between them, unclaimed by words. Ethan leaned back in his chair, the motion slow and deliberate. One hand dragged through his graying brown hair, his fingers catching briefly at his temple before dropping to his lap. The other curled loosely into a fist against his thigh, the knuckles whitening just enough to show the tension he had not voiced. His thumb traced a slow, habitual line along the ridge of his knuckles. Meeting confirmed. Across from him, Jared remained still. Not rigid, just contained. His hands rested loosely on his knees, the fingers interlaced without pressure. His posture was balanced, as if he was waiting for something he knew was coming, but could not yet name. His gaze had not left the space where the hollow projection had been. His blue eyes were unfocused, as if he were still listening for echoes that had not quite faded. Callista stood close behind Ethan's chair, one hand resting lightly against his shoulder. The contact was not possessive or restraining. It was a quiet point of orientation in the room, a reminder to breathe, to center, and of the present moment. The faint brush of the force followed her touch. She was not reaching outward or searching, simply reinforcing the boundaries of the room. No one spoke. They didn't need to. Emberlock was still in effect, not as a rule imposed, but as a shared understanding. It lived in the way Ethan did not turn immediately, in the way Jared did not ask the question sitting just behind his eyes. It was in the small economy of movement and in the fact that hands communicated what voices did not. Ethan's gauntlet haptics pulsed through the glove channel. Maintain watch. 2 short pulses, a pause, followed by another short pulse. Somewhere deeper in the veil net, Marines adjusted their positions without drawing attention. Shadow protocols engaged. Eyes on dance, not as a suspect yet, not openly at least, but as a variable no longer ignored. Hi, Sea Doodle, welcome in. Could I get a shout out for Sea Doodle, please? It's good to see you. Been a while. I hope you're well tonight. Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. I don't usually stream on a Monday, but it was May the 4th, so I figured I should. No, that's okay. I am well tonight, thank you. Ethan exhaled through his nose, the sounds barely audible. His shoulders dropped a fraction. Not in relief, but in readiness. "Let's call Card," he said, at last, his voice low and even. Jared lifted his gaze, meeting Ethan's without hesitation. There was no surprise in his expression, only acceptance. "And be ready to move," Ethan added. Callista's hand tightened once on his shoulder, not in warning, but in agreement. Her thumb pressed once at the top of his shoulder and released. Agreed. The quiet closed in around them again, steady and sealed. The next line of contact would be different, and they all felt it. I apologize if my voice is a little rough this evening. Dealing with the after effects of some cold from the weekend. And doing voice work is challenging. So bear with me a little bit. Lines in the quiet. Catan, the Card estate. The soft warble of the calm unit drew Stefan from her stillness rather than interrupting it. He set the book aside without marking the page. Whatever wisdom it held could wait. The encryption indicator had already shifted by the time he turned his chair, its color deepening along the edge of the console in a way most people in the estate would never have noticed, much less understood. Evening had settled fully over the estate by then. Beyond the tall windows of his study, the last of the mountain light had shifted to blue shadow. The quiet of the house had taken on that layered stillness it only carried after the final meal. The halls dimmed, the world reduced to low lamps, cooling stone, and the soft breath of old systems carrying warmth through ancient walls. He knew the frequency. He knew what it meant when a call came without preamble. His fingers keyed the security sequence with precision, neither hurried or lingering over the keys. The screen resolved into Ethan Bevitt's helmeted profile first, broad and unmoving in the holofeed. Jared stood just behind him, his posture controlled, his attention drawn inward. Callista's presence registered even before her image fully had. Slightly off to the side, the force held close and steady rather than extended. Her restraint doing more to define the room than any visible motion could have. Stefan inclined his head once. Ethan. Jared. His gaze softened as it settled on Callista. Urenia. Callista closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, a breath taken in acknowledgement rather than relief. The motion was small enough to be lost if one did not know her, but Stefan did. Ethan spoke first. "We've confirmed the loss," he said, carefully neutral, "but the circumstances are not what they were presented as." Stefan's index and middle finger brushed his collarbone, and then slid down his sternum in one clean, contained motion. Veil check. Ethan's gloved fist tapped twice against his chest, folded neatly inside what might have passed to anyone else as a shift in stance or an adjustment of armor. Clearance confirm. Only then did Stefan lean back, his hands folding loosely together atop the desk. "I've read Connor's report," he said evenly. "It answers the surface questions." His gaze then shifted, not to Ethan, but to Jared. "Tell me what you experienced." Jared did not rush. He grounded first. That mattered. Stefan watched the breath settle through him before the young man spoke, watched his shoulders lower, and watched the slight shift in the line of his jaw that meant he was choosing precision over immediacy. Only after that did Jared lift his hand. 2 fingers touched his temple, and then his jaw. Identity shift. Stefan returned the gesture without comment. Jared spoke of contact rather than detail, of being drawn into a space that was not a place, of a thread forming under strain, and of the difference between distance and resistance. He spoke of intent more than action, urgency rather than pain, and patterns rather than spectacle. His language was careful, not because he was hiding anything, but because he understood instinctively that careless wording would distort what the experience had actually been. When the vision sharpened, the force flickered in the room around him, not in any dramatic surge, but in the minute ways that Stefan had learned to read over years of teaching those who carried too much in silence. Callista's presence entered each shift before it could destabilize him. She did not redirect the energy. She did not shield him. She only steadied, smoothing the current where it threatened to snag, allowing him to remain inside the telling without being dragged back beneath it. When Jared reached the moment when intent shifted, where the danger extended beyond Drakkenwell, his hand flattened, palm up, and then rotated slowly, palm down. Code shift. Stefan's wrist column pulsed once. Secondary authorization engaged. One short pulse, one long pulse, another short pulse, and another long pulse. They weren't finished, Jared said quietly. Whatever failed there wasn't meant to stop at Drakkenwell. Ethan nodded once. The pattern supports that, Callista spoke. Then, not to elaborate, only to align intent. This was not improvisation, she said. Stefan listened without interrupting. He didn't close his eyes. He did not reach outward through the force. Instead, he catalogued Jared's tone, restraint, the absence of speculation, the shape of the agreement between the three of them, and the places where they chose not to overstate what they did not know. That mattered more than any single detail that he had shared. It was how one learned whether a warning had been sharpened by fear or tempered by discipline. When Jared finished, Stefan didn't ask him to clarify. "That is sufficient," he said. The words were not meant as dismissal. They were acceptance. He was not asking for proof beyond the cost already visible in the report itself. "What you're describing," he continued, "matches escalation patterns we've seen before, though never this close to the center." His gaze remained steady. "Nothing in your account contradicts what we're already tracking." That was all he offered by way of confirmation, and that was all that was needed. He shifted, his fingers unlacing as he rested his hands on the desk. Kira reached Catane Yards earlier this evening. Debrief is underway. The individual in question has been moved to a secured medical site. His thumb brushed twice along his forefinger, controlled, unhurried, and low enough against the desk that only the veil cleared would have named it for what it was. Silent pass. "There was an incident during extraction," he added. "One Marine broke formation, another intervened." Ethan's shoulders tightened. Callista's hand settled against his vambrace. Not in restraint, simply as presence, a quiet answer to tension before it could harden into action. Sorry about that. Stefan lifted his hand once. The motion was small, and then his palm lowered, his fingers held together. "All effects are secured," he continued. "Nothing will be returned to circulation until it's cleared, including the weapon." Jared nodded. There was no surprise there, only confirmation of what he'd already suspected. Stefan's gaze returned to him, intent sharpening by degrees that no one in the room would have missed. If the objective shifted from containment to erasure, he added, then this was not a failed operation. It was the only implication he allowed himself to name. It was a decision. Silence followed. Not empty, but ordered. The kind of silence that meant every person in the exchange had understood the same thing and was now measuring what could be done with it. "I will meet you on Catane," he said at last. "We'll speak with Connors, IT, and Greer, What is said beyond there will depend on what remains after verification. His hands lowered to waist-height inside the frame of the hull cam, both curled into fists, and the knuckles on his index fingers touched once. Double anchor. Ethan inclined his head. We'll bring the word. Stefan nodded once. Then we move. We have an ad starting right about now, I think, if I'm not mistaken. I will be right back, my friends. Welcome back from the ad break, my friends. I hope you took the opportunity to get a drink of water like I did. Gotta keep those vocal cords happy. Stefan remained where he was as the call ended, his hands resting on the desk as his eyes unfocused. He wasn't searching the force, but listening to the shape of what had not been said. Jared had known first. Not because he reached farther, because he noticed when something withdrew. Stefan accepted that quietly and set it aside for now. Shadows within the glass. Catane Fleet Yards. Vale Medical Wing. The Vale debriefing had left Marin hollow in a way that physical exhaustion alone never could. She had been made to walk Druckenwell's corridors again, in the telling, not once, but twice, until every turn, every shadowed alcove, and every breath drawn through grit-laden and smoke-filled air had sharpened into something almost physical. It was necessary, yes. It had been done carefully, with pauses and shielding where possible, and no one in the room had mistaken necessity for cruelty. But necessity did not soften the cost. It only made the cost unavoidable. What remained afterward was a bone-deep weariness that no amount of rest could touch, the kind that settled behind the eyes and along the spine and stayed there long after the questions ended. Have a good night, Zenny. She did not yet know when her gear would be returned. The absence of its familiar weight pressed on her more insistently than the thin hospital tunic and shorts ever could. Without it, there was nothing between her and the room but skin and breath and whatever discipline she could still muster. There was no armor on her shoulders, no vambraces against her forearms, no belt across her hips, and no saber at her back. The lack of it all left her feeling not only exposed, but unfinished, as if parts of herself had been catalogued elsewhere and not yet restored to her custody. Harris and Ral were stationed outside her room. She sensed them not through the Force, not like this, but through familiarity, through the quiet knowledge of how they stood, how Harris shifted half a step when Ral leaned, how their watch overlapped just enough to leave no seams exposed. She had known that rhythm since Pastine. There were patterns the body learned once and never forgot. The steadiness of a guarded threshold, the slight delay before a corridor was cleared, the way one Marine widened space while the other narrowed it. Somewhere in that rhythm a subtle crossbeat tapped once, paused, and then again in a sharper cadence through the haptic net. Status secure. One long pulse followed by two short. The message was not meant for her, but it passed along the line anyway, as these things always did. Perimeter holds. All clear. She had no haptic transceiver, but she could sense the faint vibrations through her teeth. Inside the room, Vec remained near the shadowed corner by the wall console, his posture loose, his attention anything but. He had found the kind of stillness Vale Marines learned only after years spent standing watch in places where the wrong movement could draw the wrong kind of attention. If he communicated at all, it was only in the smallest of motions, 2 fingers brushing the edge of his gauntlet in a short, economical sweep, as though easing stiffness from his fingers. Cover flow. All stations holding. It was enough. Marin lay back against the pillows, letting the dimmed light soften the ceiling into a blur. Dizziness still clung to her, the nausea rising and falling in slow, unpredictable waves that came hardest when she turned her head too quickly or let her thoughts sharpen too much. She closed her eyes and drew on one of Callista's centering patterns, not to open herself to the Force, but to find stillness in the narrow space that she could still reach without pain. In for 4. Hold. Out for 6. Again. The windows were darkened and sealed against any external sensor sweep. The air was sterile and faintly cold, carrying the low hum of the wing systems and the dull, ever-present throb of a shipyard, layered far beyond the walls. The gauze had been removed from her limbs. Beneath it, the burns had begun to knit into new skin. There was no healing trance here. She had not had the strength, but the regenerator's steady work and the quiet sting of Bacta had done enough. The cuts along her forearms, the burns, and the faint lines still tracing her cheekbones. Those were part of the tally now, to be counted later. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic, processed air, and the mineral tang of fresh sealant where the last dressings had been changed. Her Force presence was drawn so tightly inward that even the familiar warmth of the medical wing beyond the room was muted. It was safer that way. The sonic disruptor's residual effect and that of the chemical compounds still threaded static through her awareness, a low thrum that refused to fade. Beneath it all, the steady watch outside remained constant, less of a sound than a fact. It held the room together at the edges. A shift in the air pulled her attention toward the doorway. Stefan Card stood there, his presence as contained as ever, his shoulders squared, his posture composed in the subdued light. He filled the threshold without taking it over, calm in the way only someone long practiced at holding himself could be. Marin breathed in slowly and began to push herself upright. Reflex more than intent, but he lifted one hand in a quiet, unmistakable motion, and then his palm lowered, his fingers together. Stay. He crossed the threshold, and the door whispered shut behind him as Harris and Ral adjusted their watch. The faint sounds of the corridor beyond were sealed away. She inclined her head in a slight, formal nod. "Serenia," she said, evenly and attachir. The word cost her more than she wanted to admit. He was beside her in an instant, arranging the pillows with practiced efficiency before she could protest. The chair across the room answered a brief pull of the force and came to rest at her side. He sat, close enough to be present without crowding her, one hand resting lightly on the arm of the chair, the other open across his knee. He did not reach for her immediately. He never had when the room itself still needed to settle first. The quiet between them stretched, deliberately. Outside the door, a faint double beat pattern passed along the haptic line. Maintain watch. 2 short pulses, a pause followed by a single short pulse. Marin did not look toward it. Stefan didn't either. When she spoke, she did so carefully, as one might set down a fragile object rather than risk dropping it. He listened without interruption. His questions were sparse and precise, allowing silence where she needed to breathe. She did not retell the full scope of Druckenwald the way she had for the debrief. What she told now was narrower. It focused more on the interior, the corridors, the noise, the hollow sound of disruptors, the sensation of restraint and the way the force had been turned against her, the smell of coolant and ash, the wrongness of the silence in the gaps. Her recollection came in uneven bursts until the act of telling, in and of itself, became a measured endurance trial. He did not press when her voice faltered. He didn't soften what she chose to name. He only held the line of the conversation steady enough for her to return to it. Piece by piece, she gave him what Druckenwald had left her. At one point, his fingers rose to her temple. He was not intruding, not forcing a probe, only steadying the thread of recollection where it threatened to snag against her pain. The contact was brief and careful, enough to anchor timing and breath, but not enough to trespass into her thoughts. When his hand finally withdrew, she sagged back against the pillows and brushed damp hair from her forehead. For a moment, all she could do was breathe. "It's bad," she said, at last. It was not a question, but an assessment. Stefan didn't answer immediately. Beyond the door, a different pattern ran cleanly along the haptic line, 3 short beats, a pause, and then 2 longer pulses nested beneath the hush of the corridor's watch. Command channel secure. She could feel it pulsing behind her eyes even without a receiver. Not the exact meaning, but the shape of it. Another reminder that the watch beyond her room had tightened. He inclined his head once. "You remember the attack on Catan?" he said evenly. "I believe they are attempting a continuation of that. They did not intend for you to survive." The words landed with weight. "They were using you," he continued, "to reach beyond Druckenwald, to reach me." Shock stilled her for a moment, and she forgot to breathe. His hand came to rest on her shoulder, firm and grounding, anchoring her back into the present before the thought could drag her somewhere else. It was not comfort in the softer sense. It was contact with purpose, a reminder of where she was, who was in the room, and what remained under her control. "The fact that you are here tells me they failed. But we will not assume that failure will deter them." She absorbed that in silence. Outside, the watch shifted again. A new pulse pattern moved across the line, 1 short beat, then 3 long, spaced far enough apart to hold gravity. Watch maintained. So sorry. "Yes, Tiranya," she replied at last, acceptance wrapped in formality, her resolve steadied by discipline rather than comfort. His presence settled over her like a shield without becoming a burden. That had always been one of his quietest gifts, to hold the ground around a student without making them feel caged inside it. By the time he guided her into a light healing trance, the rhythm outside had steadied, matching the room's quiet heartbeat. He spoke little, a phrase here, a breath cue there, his hand lowered once at the edge of her blanket, his fingers easing outward and stilling an emotion too small to name, closer to ritual modulation than an actual command. Keserim. She let it carry her under, not because the danger had passed, but because, for now, she was safe. Shadows on the flight path. Aboard the Werda, en route to Catane. The Werda's cockpit was a study in disciplined quiet. Stars stretched into pale threads beyond the forward armor plast, their lights smeared by velocity and distance. Ethan sat at the helm, his posture steady and his grip loose but certain on the controls. The low hum of the drives threaded through the space, constant, reliable, and something he could measure time against if he needed to. The instruments gave off a cool blue glow across the consoles, enough to define hands, profiles, and readouts without ever fully warming the room. The ship felt alert beneath them, not tense but narrowed toward a purpose. Callista occupied the co-pilot seat beside him. Her profile was etched in the soft light of the displays, her blue eyes moving with quiet precision as she monitored readouts that required no correction. She glanced toward Ethan once, not with a question, but in alignment, and she waited. The restraint in that glance was familiar by now. It was not passivity. It was readiness held in reserve. He didn't look away from the navigation feed. Instead, his right hand dipped subtly at waist level, two fingers angling toward the console before flicking outward to the side in motion small enough to vanish into the act of flying the ship. Inform the watch. Callista's jaw shifted in acknowledgement. She reached for the comm controls, her motions unhurried and deliberate. A finger brushed the encrypted channel toggle, then keyed in the scramble sequence without her gaze ever leaving the forward sensors. The line steadied with a soft click. Aran's image resolved in the small holo projection above the console. He stood in what appeared to be the outer corridor of the Southern Colony's main building. The stone walls behind him were faintly damp, his dark hair wind-tossed as though he'd only just come in from outside. His eyes flicked once between them, reading posture and spacing before words. Whatever he saw there altered the line of his mouth, a shift too small to be called surprise and too deliberate to be missed by anyone who knew him. Ethan, Callista, a pause and then a Mandoa, low and measured. Mabana. Ethan's reply was mild, his gaze still forward. Movement to Catane, a fleet matter. Aran's mouth tightened almost imperceptibly. He had never needed much to hear what lay underneath a sentence. So sorry. Pressure showed itself in omission as often as it did in emphasis, and there was enough of it here to change the shape of the call. And this comes from? Callista leaned slightly into the hollow frame, her voice even. Orders routed from the yards. Priority handover. The words were deliberately bland. Her left hand, however, drifted across her thigh, three fingers pressing and holding before easing into a slow curl. She is alive. Aran's green eyes dropped for half a second, not at the words, but to the movement of her hand, and then lifted again. The barest nod followed. It was not exactly relief, but recognition, a single missing piece settling into place. I felt the air change, he said quietly, as if commenting on the weather. The past couple of days, something's been moving. His gaze cut sideways off frame. The edge of Newell's shoulder came briefly into view. He murmured something to her in Mandoa, not a report, just a placement of attention. The tone was too light to draw notice and too exact to be casual. When he looked back to the call, his expression had settled. "What's your cover here?" Ethan's fingers tapped the control yoke twice, casual to anyone who didn't know him. His right thumb hooked inward as the warder's course adjusted. Routine, cover, eyes open. "Hold the colony," he said aloud. "If something tips past your reach, call the Marines." Iran's expression eased into the faintest wry smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Understood. We'll keep the hearth warm." He lifted his right fist to his chest in the old warrior salute, and the hollow winked out. For a moment, neither Ethan nor Callista spoke. The cockpit had held the steady hum of the drives and the faint static of the comm system cycling back to passive receive. Outside, the stars continued their slow, silent drift. Callista's hand moved at last. 2 short sweeps across her knee, the second lighter than the first. "He knows more than he said." Ethan answered with a lazy scratch along the side of his neck, his brown eyes still on the flight path. "Good." The console chirped softly before she could reply. A proximity alert. Callista's gaze snapped to the nearest sensor readout. 2 contacts, steady vectors closing fast. She keyed the transponder query. The return flashed green. 2 friendlies, she murmured. Fast movers. Ethan leaned forward, scanning the identifiers as the first Nighthawk slid into view, banking across the warder's bow before peeling away to starboard. The second mirrored the maneuver, settling to port. "Nighthawks," he said, recognition softening his expression by a degree he didn't comment on. The comm crackled to life, audio only. "Werda, Blackhawk 9 and Blackhawk 5. Orders are to escort you to the designated berth." Stryker's voice, clipped and precise. Ethan keyed the mic. "Acknowledged, Blackhawk 9. Following your lead." He let the channel drop, his eyes tracking the fighters as they settled into formation. Not standard procedure. Soft footsteps sounded in the corridor behind them. Jared stepped into the cockpit, pausing at the empty comm station before leaning forward to take in the sight of the Nighthawks flanking them. He studied their movement for a moment, the way they held spacing, and the familiarity in the angle of their approach. "She's flown with them before," he said quietly. "At least the lead." Ethan's grip on the yoke eased slightly. "Danek's people." Jared nodded. "She'll take comfort in that." His tone made clear what he meant. "If she's awake enough to notice." The warder held course, the escort steady on either side, and the flight path ahead narrowed into something deliberate. Watched, guarded, and no longer entirely theirs. The approach vector changed without ceremony. Blackhawk 9 rolled first, banking sharply to port off the warder's bow before dropping beneath her ventral plane. Blackhawk 5 mirrored the movement a heartbeat later, sliding high and wide to port. Their formation stretched, not loosening, but reorienting, a funnel rather than the shield. Callista's gaze tracked the movements. "They're not taking us to general traffic control," she said quietly. "No," Ethan agreed. "They're clearing a lane." Ahead, the shipyard's outer lattice shifted. Navigation beacons dimmed and then winked out entirely along a narrow corridor as the warder was handed off from the automated guidance to direct Veil escort control. The change was subtle but unmistakable, like stepping off a public thoroughfare into a guarded passage where names no longer mattered. Blackhawk 9's voice returned on a tight beam channel, stripped to the bare minimum. "Werda, hold current speed. We'll bring you in." Ethan complied without hesitation, easing the drive throttles back as the Nighthawks took point. Below them, an armored hangar opened slowly. It was not one of the broad, illuminated bays meant for general fleet traffic, but a recessed cavity cut deep into the shipyard structure. Its interior lights were low, its markings deliberately sparse. Blackhawk 5 peeled away at the threshold, rolling hard to starboard to take station above and slightly forward of the hangar's MAGCON field. Blackhawk 9 followed the warder down, staying close until the last possible moment before breaking off and sealing the approach behind them. As the warder crossed the threshold, the outer doors began to close. The stars vanished bit behind layered armor, and the warder slipped fully into shadow. Okay. Need a little bit of water. Alright. Give me 1 second here. We have an ad starting in about 5 minutes. Alright. Under seal and shadow, Katani Naval Shipyards, veil secured hangar. Inside the hangar, every movement spoke of intent. There were no idle crews, no technicians bent over open housings or diagnostic scaffolds. The deck lay bare beneath the high vaulted bulkheads of the bay, its markings sharp and unmarred, the air carrying only the faint tang of ozone and coolant. Light pooled in controlled bands overhead, leaving the edges of the space in shadow. 3 figures waited at the line where illumination ended. The warder settled onto the deck with a controlled shudder as Ethan powered down the drives. The hum fell away, leaving only the whisper of cooling systems cycling through shutdown. He rose from the helm without hurry. Callista was already on her feet beside him, her posture composed. From the sensor console, Jared stepped forward, adjusting his stride to match theirs. Ethan's right hand flexed at his side, the fingertips brushing twice in quick succession. "Stay sharp," Callista answered with a half curl of her fingers. "Always." They descended the short stairs together as the main hatch cycled open, the ramp lowering into the muted glow of the hangar lights beyond. IT stood just beyond the red safety lines painted into the deck, his stance squared, his chin lifted. The shadow sharpened the angles of his face. Greer waited just off his right shoulder, his gray eyes tracking the warder's crew with practiced ease. To IT's left, Vec held position, his weight balanced as if he could move in any direction without telegraphing intent. Behind them, not quite in formation and not quite separate, stood 2 additional Marines. Oops. They wore no identifying marks beyond the matte seal at their collars. Their armor bore no unit sigils, no personal modifications. To anyone without clearance, they might have appeared redundant. To those who knew better, their presence said everything. Callista's gaze met Greer's across the intervening meters. She brushed 2 fingers along the seam of her trousers and stilled them. Acknowledged. Greer answered with a fractional tilt of his chin, his fingers touching the edge of his belt. Seen. "Hello, Singard. Welcome in. It's good to see you." "I am, thank you. I hope you're well tonight." Jared came down the ramp last. His boots met the deck with quiet finality. Without pausing, he lifted his right fist to chest level, tapped twice, and opened his hand, palm down, toward IT. Confirmed veil clearance and operational readiness. IT's reply was immediate. Both hands curled into fists, his knuckles meeting once at waist height. Identity confirmed. Authority holds. No words were exchanged. From IT's left glove, a faint vibration rippled through the embedded haptic unit, 3 short pulses, 2 long, and 1 short. Status hold. No change. The signal routed cleanly through the veil band and was transmitted directly to Harris and Raoul at their post. Outside the secured medical suite. The response returned seconds later, sharp and economical. Area secure, all quiet. Ethan's eyes flicked once toward the far hatch leading to the lift corridor. He did not turn his head. IT shifted his weight and inclined his chin in that direction. The movement alone was sufficient. As they fell in behind him, Greer stepped forward, and for the first time the additional Marines moved, not into the center of the group, not ahead of it, but offset just enough to bracket the formation. Their spacing was exact, their attention never wavered. I'm going to pause right there because we have an ad starting in about 5 seconds. I will see you guys in a minute and a half. Get yourselves a snack or a drink. Catch you in a bit. All right, my friends, we are back from our ad break. I hope you took the opportunity to actually get a drink of water because I definitely did. It's important. All right. As they passed beneath the shadowed overhang, one of the Marines extended a small datapad toward IT. It bore no markings and no visible interface, but it had Connor's seal. IT accepted it without looking. His thumb pressed once against the interface. The screen flared briefly, unreadable to anyone without the correct biometrics, and then went dark. The datapad warmed for half a second and then cooled, its surface blank. The order was delivered. There would be no record. The overhead lights dimmed as they entered the corridor, illumination narrowing into a controlled channel that guided them toward the lift. The low thrum of the shipyard's main lines vibrated faintly through the decking, a reminder of the armored world layered above and around them. No one spoke. The lift doors closed with a soft hiss, enclosing them in shadow. As the lift began its descent, the only sounds were the muted sound of their breathing and the quiet, coded vibrations of haptic confirmations, each checkpoint answering in turn as they passed deeper into the secured space. The escort adjusted seamlessly, one Marine shifting half a step forward, the other half a step back. Their escort detail would not break off upon exiting the lift. They would follow to the medical wing. They would hold the perimeter beyond Harris and Rao. They would remain until Connors said otherwise, or until the threat was no longer theoretical, Under seal, under shadow. And until the orders changed, nothing about that would. Oh. Under seal and shadow. Oops. Oh, that's not that one. Sorry. Give me 1 second. Alright, 1 second. Yeah. That's the wrong scene. I got myself confused. Here we are. Measured on the veil. Catane, Fleet Yards, Command Wing, Connor's office. The corridor leading back to the Admiral's office was silent except for the measured cadence of boots on deck sole. It was not a silence born of discomfort, but out of habit, the kind cultivated in spaces where the wrong ear might always be just beyond the next corner. Connors walked at the rear of the group, allowing... Whoops, hold on. Hold on 1 second. I am missing a scene here. One second. Okay. All right. There we go. Yep. I lost my place for a second. Ah. I am missing an entire scene. What? Alright. Give me just a moment while I check this. Yeah, I'm missing an entire scene. Nah. There we go. That happens sometimes when I'm doing editing. Sorry about that, guys. Yeah. Yeah, something was weird. Somehow lost a little scene there that's kind of important. There we go. Okay. Okay. That's the right scene. Between the lines. Katani Naval Shipyard's Vale-secured medical wing. It took them only a few minutes to reach the medical wing, but to Jared it stretched into something longer and heavier. The corridors here carried the quiet clinical scent of antiseptic layered over the faint mineral tang of shipyard air that never fully dissipated. The hum of filtered circulation was constant and low, a reminder that this wing existed apart from the rest of the installation, sealed, controlled, and designed to hold what could not be allowed to wander. His awareness widened as they moved, cataloging what had changed since the last time he had walked these halls. Harris and Ral were visible ahead, stationed at the sealed door to the medical suite, their familiar silhouettes easy enough to recognize even at a distance. Beyond them, however, the geometry of the corridor had shifted. Lines of sight were held further back. Angles that had once been empty were no longer so. Figures occupied the deeper shadow, unmarked, still, and placed with deliberate care. They did not announce themselves. They didn't need to. Ethan saw it too. His gaze swept the corridor in a slow, practiced arc, noting every guard, every reflective surface, and every point where sound or motion might carry. He said nothing. Neither did Jared. They all understood what it meant when the perimeter thickened without comment. A subtle flick of Gur's left hand executed low at thigh height broke the silence. All clear. Approach with caution. Jared gave the barest dip of his chin in acknowledgement and let his senses widen just enough to confirm what he already knew. Marin was just down the corridor. Her presence was faint but steady, and restless in the way of someone holding themselves upright through sheer will alone. Guer's next signal was smaller still. Emberluck remains active. The meaning was unmistakable. Outside these walls, she was dead. That fiction held here as firmly as anywhere else. Harris straightened from the wall as they closed in, his attention never leaving the corridor beyond them. His gauntlet transmitted a haptic pulse, 2 short, 1 long, followed by 1 short. Secure, entry permitted. The response did not come directly. It came in staggered bursts relayed through the deeper line before settling back into the Veil network. The outer ring acknowledged. The seal held. He stepped aside, granting them access, but his posture never relaxed. Ral mirrored him on the opposite side of the door, his weight balanced and his eyes tracking the shadows beyond the immediate approach. No one would come near that door without being seen. Not after Druckenwell. IT crossed the threshold first. His salute to Harris and Ral was crisp, precise, and carried the quiet authority of someone who knew that the air inside this room was heavier than it appeared. Vec followed close at his shoulder, his position shifting subtly to keep every angle covered. Ethan entered next, offering Harris a fractional nod in passing. Callista paused at the threshold for a single breath, her attention sliding inward, gauging the tension and the rhythm of the space beyond the door. When she inclined her chin toward Jared, it was not permission so much as alignment. He moved without hesitation. Greer entered last. He closed the door until the latch caught with a low, definitive click, and then took up a position just inside the tinted transparistile, with his back to it, granting him a clear angle on both the corridor beyond and the occupants of the room within. His gloved hand shifted at his side, just enough for IT to see. Perimeter sealed. No external breach. Marin had been speaking with Stefan when the door opened. Her voice was low and controlled. She stilled the moment her gaze landed on the newcomers. Her body reacted without thought, before thought could intervene, and she began to rise, reflex and habit reasserting themselves even through fatigue. IT's right hand cut downward slowly, remained seated. She let out a quiet breath and obeyed at once. "Yes, sir," she murmured. Her spine straightened regardless, her focus shifting immediately to Ethan, Jared, and Callista. Stefan greeted IT and Greer with the warrior's grip, his expression composed, and then stepped aside to lean against the wall near her bed. His eyes tracked the room, registering every shift and placement. "Thank you for coming," he said evenly. No one rushed forward. The air held still for a moment as though waiting to see who'd move first. IT took up a position at Marin's side, his posture relaxed. Only in appearance. "How are you feeling?" he asked. Even as he spoke, his left thumb tapped twice against his thigh, the signal meant for Greer alone. Status unchanged. Marin's sigh carried more weight than her actual words. "Like I went 3 rounds with a rancor." Her gaze flicked briefly towards Greer, her left index finger curling inward against her palm in a tight, deliberate motion. "My thanks to the medical team." Greer's nod was small and precise. The stillness shifted when Jared stepped forward. He took her hands gently, grounding himself before he leaned in. His contact was careful and deliberate as he pressed his forehead to hers, briefly, just long enough to let the connection settle between them. "Okovin." A quiet exhale escaped Marin, tension easing from her shoulders as if she had finally been reminded that she didn't have to hold herself alone. Callista noticed it immediately. So did Ethan. Something in the set of his jaw softened, even as his attention remained sharp. Stefan's gaze lingered, thoughtful rather than surprised. Greer and IT saw it too. They registered as intimacy, as reassurance, but its deeper meaning remained just out of their reach. Callista caught the flicker of relief in Stefan's eyes, mirrored faintly in her own. Ethan said nothing. Callista's hand came to rest on his shoulder, grounding him. "Later," her look said. They settled one by one into the sparse seating. Words passed between them, some aloud, others in the quiet language of the Vale. When Marin began her account of Druckenwell, her eyes went first to IT, a request for permission. His nod was shallow but deliberate. Marin took a slow breath. It caught in her chest at first and then deepened as she forced it lower, anchoring herself the way Jarius had taught her, without reaching for the force. When she lifted her gaze again, her eyes were steady. "Druckenwell wasn't a mistake," she said. "It was a trap." The words landed without heat, but they carried weight all the same. "We were sent into a factory we believed was holding civilians. It wasn't. They were waiting for us, with stun nets, sonic disruptors, overlapping fields meant to separate and disorient. I was taken early." Her fingers tightened once against the blankets before she stilled them. "They restrained me. They used lightning, not to kill me, just enough to keep me conscious. There was a Chiss woman, a Sith, I think. She wanted information, fleet numbers, patrol strength, and a direction for Catan." She paused and took a measured breath. "I didn't give her anything willingly." She swallowed, her breath hitching just once before she got it under control. "She injected me with something. After that, the force didn't go quiet. It turned hostile when I tried to use it. Static, nausea. I couldn't keep focus, and I still can't. Not even now." The room remained silent. "I lost time. There are gaps I can't account for. I don't know if that means that they took something from me or if it was just the shock and pain. I woke up outside the facility alone." Her gaze drifted briefly unfocused and then returned to those around her. "I realized after a while that they weren't chasing me. They were hurting me, driving me towards our perimeter. I didn't have the strength to run. I crawled most of the way back. When I reached the med tent, someone spoke my name. Her voice didn't break, but it tightened. Not long after, there was a shot through the wall. Corporal Morandi took the bolt meant for me. She let the silence stretch, honoring the cost without words. He died because my presence was known. Only then did she shift, just enough to ease the ache in her ribs. I found the tracker afterward. It wasn't on my armor or in my gear. It was inside my lightsaber, embedded within the central crystal. Her gaze lifted again, steady and clear despite the haze. The crystal was already cracked when I found it, not from damage in the field. It was done deliberately. That landed. If I hadn't noticed it, if someone else had tried to activate the saber later, it could have failed catastrophically. I don't know if it would have injured them or killed them, but it wasn't safe. She exhaled slowly. Whatever they intended, it wasn't just to follow me. I disconnected the power cell and removed the tracker to stop the signal, but the damage was already done. She leaned back against the pillows, fatigue creeping into her posture now that the telling was nearly done. I don't know when the tracker was placed. I don't know who inside the line wanted me dead, and I don't trust my memories yet. Not completely. Her voice softened. I'm alive, but whatever they used on Dracomel hasn't finished working its way out of my system. She fell silent. Not for lack of words, but because she'd reached the limit of what she could carry in one breath. When she finished, the room held the silence with care. Only when the nurse entered did the veil traffic begin to ease, replaced by outward formality. IT's hand lowered once more. Remained seated. They shifted aside to allow her through. Outside, Harris's gauntlet haptics transmitted a brief string. 3 long, 1 short, 1 long. Session complete. Secure. The response echoed outward, tightening the corridor rather than emptying it. Inside the room, the rest moved towards the door, expressions measured and silence heavy with what had not been spoken aloud. Marin's blue eyes followed them until the door shut, the coded signals fading back into the undercurrent where they belonged. The watch remained. Here we go. Yeah, I knew I was missing a scene in there somewhere. It read wrong. There we go. Measured on the veil. The corridor leading back to the Admiral's office was silent except for the measured cadence of boots on Dexel. It was not a silence born of discomfort, but out of habit, the kind cultivated in spaces where the wrong ear might always be just beyond the next corner. Sorry. There we go. Connors walked at the rear of the group, allowing the others to precede him, his attention turned inward as he worked through the web of what had already been shared. The corridor lighting was low and even, reflecting dully off the sealed bulkheads and the narrow strips of reinforced transparasteel overlooking the inner fleet yards. Somewhere beyond the bulkheads, a tug engine thrummed to life and faded again. Even here, nothing intruded. As they reached the hatch, he stepped ahead, palming it open and holding position just long enough to scan the outer corridor. Only then did he follow them inside. The hatch sealed with a muted hiss behind him, and he pivoted immediately towards IT. His left hand rose only as far as the front seam of his uniform, his fingers drawing inward twice as if settling the jacket before the hand flattened briefly against the frame of the hatch and fell away. Retrieve the secured asset. IT's eyes narrowed. He inclined his head once, acknowledgement without ceremony, and turned back toward the corridor beyond. The hatch sealed behind him. The rest moved deeper into the office. The faint scent of brewed calf and mountain tea lingered in the air. Connor's yeoman had anticipated the meeting and set a tray neatly on the low table in front of his desk. Connors shed his duty cap and moved behind the desk with economical precision. Stefan and Ethan took the chairs opposite him. Jared sat onto the couch with Callista beside him, while Greer ignored the seating entirely, planting himself against the bulkhead in a half lean that kept his line of sight on the hatch. That's fair, Greer. Jared lifted his left hand slowly, catching Ethan's eye first and then Connor's. 2 fingers brushed once at his temple as though easing strain behind his eyebrows. The hand drifted outward, low and palm down across the line of his knee, and then closed into a quiet fist against his thigh. Sweep and clear before exchange. Ethan acknowledged with a slight nod. Callista mirrored the signal without hesitation. Both had learned the code under Greer and Ethan's instruction long before this moment. They waited as Jared closed his eyes and extended his senses. His touch in the Force was not as surgical in the way that Marin's could be. It was broader, searching for the unnatural eddies that concealed devices tended to leave behind. The seconds passed without comment. When he opened his eyes again, he gave a short nod towards Connors. Clear. Only then did Greer move. He unhooked his thumb from his belt and rolled one shoulder, the motion casual enough to pass as a stretch, though his eyes never softened. Sir, he began evenly, there's more to Halloran than bad luck and being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Connor's gaze sharpened, but he said nothing, letting the Master Sergeant continue. Vec, Harris, Ral, and I started a quiet log from the day she arrived on exchange, Greer said. We never marked it officially. Veil only. Too many flags too early. Contact patterns with Dance were steady. There was nothing directly in the open, but too many overlaps in tasking to be a coincidence. On Druckenwell, Halloran's placement put him in every angle she'd have to cross. That kind of positioning only happens if you're handed the grid. Ethan's jaw flexed, the only outward sign of his reaction. Greer continued, his voice steady. Comm checks with non-cleared personnel ran higher than baseline. Proximity to her during high-value transits was consistent, and intel pings lined up within hours of her movement orders. Twice. That isn't chance. Connors leaned back slightly, the subtle tilt of his head enough to signal Greer to continue. Dance plays the long game, Greer said flatly. We've seen his type. He's good enough to look like he's exactly where he's supposed to be. But Halloran? He's the one who put her on the field where they could take a shot. Druckenwell was proof of that. I don't believe that he didn't know. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was measured, each person in the room quietly marking how the pieces aligned. Connor's gaze moved from Ethan to Stefan and then back to Greer. His right hand shifted near the desk, his index finger tracing a shallow curve against the wood as though following a mark in the grain before the fingertip pressed once downward and stilled. Hold secured asset under veil. Halloran was not going anywhere. Jared leaned back slightly, the weight of the exchange settling across his shoulders. Then we know where to start, he said. In the hush that followed, Greer's hand rested lightly on the butt of his sidearm, not because he expected trouble here, but because vigilance, like the veil, was reflex. Connors nodded once, deliberately. His ring finger brushed the desktop twice before his palm settled flat against it. His gaze remained on Ethan and Stefan. Threat vector confirmed. He reached for his tea and took an unhurried sip. From what little we've gathered, he said evenly, they're working closely with the Sith and acting as their enforcers. They've been conscripting along our borders, leaning on family ties to keep their draftees compliant. Halloran, though, his eyes narrowed slightly, not from the outer colonies. Born on Catan, merchant service before the Marines, claims his ship was taken in a Death Watch raid. Says he was the only survivor. So sorry. Ethan frowned, his thumb tapping lightly against the edge of the table. 3 short beats, a pause, and then 2 more. Probability of fabrication, confirm or deny. Is there any way to verify this? He asked. Stefan exhaled softly, his gaze dropping for a moment. I could search his thoughts, he said, but given what we've just outlined, I don't believe that would be wise. And I'm going to stop right there as we are about to be in an ad. Be right back. Welcome back from the ad break, my friends. I do hope you actually took the opportunity to get yourselves a drink of water. I have been having to do that tonight. My voice is not entirely cooperating with me today. Jared's hand rested loosely on his knee. His fingers brushed once along the seam of his trousers, following it outward in a short line, and then curled inward towards his palm as if reconsidering the movement before it began. Not you. Not her. Keep unseen. No, Tiranya, Jared said aloud, the word carrying a weight. Nor Marin. They should believe she's still out of the picture. Allow me. I am an unknown. Stefan studied him in silence. Ethan's brown eyes narrowed, assessing more than the offer itself. Jared leaned forward slightly, lifting his calf to buy a moment to settle his breathing before meeting Ethan's gaze. The only major mission I've been directly involved in with her was Korriban. Ethan's frown deepened. Stefan's subtle nod granted him permission to continue. As much as I wanted to take a more active role, Jared went on, I know those experiences were for her alone. Being more visible would have put her at a greater risk. Greer's stance shifted just enough for Jared to notice the faint downward press of his thumb along his thigh. Doubt registered. You're certain you want to do this? Stefan asked. Jared nodded sharply, his gaze flicking to Ethan. It's the least I can do, given what she's been through, Tiranya. Oops. Ethan returned the nod, slowly and deliberately. Connors observed the exchange carefully, weighing what had not been said. You say that, Connors remarked, like you're trying to make amends. Jared drew a deep breath. Callista's presence brushed against his mind, steady and ready. I haven't spoken of this beyond our family and Master Card, Jared said, because of what it means. You know her history with Deathwatch, her father's as well, to a point. Connors and Greer inclined their heads. They knew enough. Was the son of one of Duran's lieutenants, Algren. He watched the name land between them. My father was part of the campaign against hers. I disagreed with it, and I didn't know the full details of it until after I left. He tapped his chest once and then drew his hand away. The motion was personal more than procedural, but the room understood it all the same. Separated myself from his path. I came to Catan and devoted myself to Master Card's instruction, he continued. Standing where I can protect her now is part of making that right. The room held the silence. Callista squeezed his shoulder gently. Ethan's voice, when it came, was calm to the point of steel. Does she know? Jared's eyes closed briefly. I don't know. I tried to tell her the last time she was home. But you know what happened. Ethan exhaled slowly, dragging a hand back through his graying hair. Sorry. If you hadn't proven yourself, he said flatly, I'd lay you out where you stand. You'd have every right, Jared replied. I love her, and I'll protect her with everything I have. Stefan lifted one hand only as far as the arm of his chair, palm lowered, fingers still. Thank you, Jared, he said quietly. That wasn't easy. Connors leaned forward, both hands flat on the desk. If you're willing, I'd like you to speak with intelligence. We're building a clearer picture, and every piece matters. Greer's combat knife turned slowly in his hand. They plan to hit Contain and MasterCard, he said. Possibly Ethan as well. All high-value targets. If we can pull more from Halloran and from Jared, we may be able to get ahead of them. Good evening, Lord. Good to see you. Connor's index finger slid forward against the desk in a short, deliberate line, no more conspicuous than the motion of nudging a datapad into place. Proceed, under veil. No one questioned the order. The air in the intelligence division... Under seal and shadow. The air in the intelligence division was cooler than the main corridors, filtered and scrubbed to a sterile precision that left the faint tang of ozone on the tongue. Captain IT's stride set a measured cadence down the narrow spine of the wing, the muted echo on the dexel reminding him how far from open air they were. He would have preferred to remain in the meeting with the Admiral, but Emberlock protocol prioritized first-hand handling of recovered gear over his attendance at the briefing. He passed through 3 sealed hatches before the muted amber glow of the laboratory's privacy lamps came into view. The room beyond was quiet, lit in the even amber of standby mode, the kind of light that made every object look suspended in stillness. The duty officer glanced up from his console at the sound of the hatch opening. Recognition flickered in the young lieutenant's eyes as he straightened. Sir, he said, his voice low, gesturing IT inward. In the center of the room, 2 long tables were arranged in deliberate symmetry. One bore the remnants of a Marine's deployment, fatigues laid flat, the weave of the fabric scorched in places. The other held weapons and field kit aligned with surgical precision. IT's gaze lingered on the lines of the armor, each plate charred and pitted, edges melted and feathered with charring where high heat had kissed the surface. He did not look at them as personal artifacts or effects. Emberluck required more distance than that. But the memory of Collier rose unbidden. The injuries bore the same signature. The lieutenant moved toward the weapons table and rested one hand beside the single object set apart from the rest. A lightsaber and a sealed containment cradle. Oh, sorry. You're just in time, Captain. I completed the scans and physical inspection just a few minutes ago. What did you find? IT's voice was flat, almost disinterested. Another Emberluck layer, denying anything that might hint at specific ownership or consequence. The young lieutenant carefully unlatched the cradle and lifted the hilt just enough to indicate the inspection ports. Your suspicion was correct. There was an encoded tracker embedded inside. Imperial make, older encryption schema. Whoever placed it knew exactly where to hide it. It was still active until... He paused, meeting IT's eyes. Until it was rendered inert by the wielder. How? I couldn't tell you. But the power cell's been disconnected and the primary crystal is cracked. IT's jaw tightened, though the movement was slight. Has the signal been cloned? The lieutenant shook his head once. No, sir. It would have risked bringing its source here. We did record the encryption for later study, but made no trace attempt. He indicated a small, clear container on the tray beside the cradle. The tracker chip, now rendered harmless. The rest of the hilt showed no tampering. Whatever damage it sustained, it wasn't from mishandling and recovery. Continue. The emergency beacon installed as a secondary locator was fried. The circuitry melted, likely exposed to a high-voltage discharge consistent with... The lieutenant stopped himself and recalibrated. Consistent with certain forms of directed energy. That matches the burn pattern on the armor. One sidearm and a combat vibroblade are missing, as is the combat helmet. RT's gaze swept across the scorched place on the table. Other findings? The lieutenant consulted his datapad. The remaining vibroblade, tags, and auxiliary gear are clean. The armor bears the same sonic stress signatures noted in your prior report, compounded by a biochemical agent designed to intensify disorientation and disrupt cognitive focus. There was a fractional pause. Resistance to interrogation under those conditions would have been difficult. The captain gave the barest nod. Noted. A silence settled as the lieutenant crossed the smaller workbench, retrieving a low-profile case. He placed 3 sets of tags inside, 2 familiar and 1 newly forged. The original and her father's have been cleared. I had a duplicate set run with the same identifiers in case... He stopped short of finishing the thought. In case it's needed. From its cradle, the lightsaber was transferred into a shielded case. This will block all known scan methods. Force-based sensing, he just shrugged, is beyond my scope. IT accepted the cases without comment. Their weight was nothing compared to the weight of what they represented. Then, deliberate and precise, he let his left hand drift slightly from the cases, his fingers closing in a short, sharp curl, before sweeping down and across at a 45-degree angle, under seal to be held in silence. The lieutenant's eyes flicked to the signal. Without hesitation, he flattened his palm, drew it to his chest, and tapped twice over his heart. Acknowledged. No names, no conditions. Only the signal and its reply, clean and contained within the silence that Emberluck demanded. IT gave a single crisp nod, securing the cases under his arm. Without further words, he stepped back into the corridor's cool air, the hatch sealing behind him with a muted hiss. He did not look back. Silence is not absence. It is a weapon, and we choose when to draw it. Veil Doctrine, Oral Maxim 21. Under veil, quiet does not mean inaction. It is a deliberate posture, held until the moment's speech or movement will do more good than harm. Command is exercised not only through orders given, but through information withheld, timing controlled, and lines quietly redrawn beyond public sight. Silence here is not hesitation. It is readiness sharpened by restraint. And that, my friends, is chapter 21. I will be streaming again on Wednesday next week with some more Stray. I'd love to see you come back and hang out with me if you're so inclined. I do hope you enjoyed the chapter this evening. I apologize for the state of my voice. I am apparently still recovering, so apologies for that. But we got through it. I am going to see if there's someone that we can go say hi to. Let's find out. Oh, sorry. I have an idea. Yeah. I have an awesome idea. Okay. We are going to go say hi to Camilla Panda, who is someone that I actually know from... I actually kind of ran into her at PAX. She's really chill. And she is currently streaming for St. Jude and playing Tomodachi Life. Not a game that I've played before, but looks fun, and she is raising funds for St. Jude. So we are going to go say hi. Again, thank you so much for hanging out with me tonight. I appreciate you all, and I hope that this was an awesome way to end the middle of your week. Alright. For those of you who are subscribed to the channel, please feel free to grab that first raid message, and if you are following the channel or simply lurking, please feel free to grab that second one. And I hope to see you all next week. And please come back and see me for the continuation of this story in 2 weeks with chapter 22. Have a great night, everybody.